Okay, perfect. How are you doing today, everybody? It is early in the morning, 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time, which means it's 8:16 a.m. Central Time. You people on the Pacific Coast, man, you're not even thinking about waking up yet. But I want to get this video out of the way. This is something that I kind of want to do. I'm interested in right now. I'm kind of in this mode. And so I want to present to you some information that I think will be helpful to you. You've been watching Don Preston debates. You've been watching other theological debates about the existence of God or about whether or not we should do this or do that or whatever. Well, when you're watching those debates, oftentimes somebody's going to say, this is a syllogism, and then they're going to say, this is my major premise, and this is my minor premise, and this is my conclusion. And for all of us laymen out there, we're sitting there saying, I do not know what you are talking about. I don't know if that's been your experience, but that's been my experience. Especially when I first started watching debates and they started talking about all these syllogisms. I was like, what is going on? I don't have a clue. Well, now I do have a clue. And I want to share that clue with you so that you too can have a clue like I do. The book that I like the best on this subject is called Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft, and it is a textbook, so it's going to be a little bit more expensive than other logic books that you'll find, but it is fantastic. I think you'll really enjoy it. Peter Kreeft, Socratic Logic. Definitely pick it up if you're interested in learning about the finer things of logic and debate. So the title of this has like 5 different titles: how to argue, how to reason, basics of syllogisms, whatever you want to call it. But this is what we're going to be doing for the next few minutes. I don't know how long this is going to take. Could take 20 minutes, could take, 2 hours, I'm not sure. We're going to have fun regardless. So, before you get into this, I want to explain why you want to get into this. Because whenever someone argues, whenever someone tries to make a point, they usually just like throw out 1,000 things at one time. All this, just this explosion of information. And it's your job to take this explosion of information and basically ask the question, is this right? Does this make sense? Now, usually what happens is someone gives an explosion of information, and then somebody else who doesn't agree with that person, they give out an explosion of information, and nobody really gets anything done. It's just kind of all this nonsense floating around that you got to sort out and dig through and think about and pick through. And forming arguments, though, in a syllogistic form is going to be so extraordinarily helpful to you in determining what makes sense and what doesn't. Because when you put it into this form called a syllogism, they've been using it since the ancient times, back with Aristotle. There are actually legitimate rules that you can look at to basically ask yourself the question, does this fit? You basically just plug in different parts of the argument and ask, does this fit? If it does fit, you've got a pretty you have a pretty big responsibility to determine the validity of it there, or the truthfulness of it. And then if it doesn't fit, then you say, okay, nice try, come back and try again. So when you form it this way, and a syllogism, and we're going to go over all this, don't worry, there's basically 3 conditions that every argument everywhere has to meet. All right, 3 conditions. If someone gives an argument and they don't meet one of these 3 conditions, you can send them back and say, okay, try again. Number 1, all the terms must be clear, i.e., all the terms must be properly defined. I can give you an example of this later on perhaps, but for instance, when we talk about the coming of the Lord, some individuals say there's multiple comings of the Lord. Someone like me would say, no, there's one coming of the Lord. And they would say, aha, see there, you don't agree with the Bible because the Bible teaches multiple comings of the Lord. Well, the problem with that exchange is the way that we're using terms is different. I'm using the term with the mindset, okay, I'm talking about specifically the parousia of Christ. When this Greek word parousia is used in relation to the Lord, this is what I mean by the coming of the Lord. But what another individual might mean is, well, this is God coming to destroy Babylon, and this is God coming to destroy Israel, and this is God coming to destroy the world, and this is God coming to indwell an individual, or this is God coming to through the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, whatever. Say, so there's different definitions that we have, and unless we make our terms clear, then there's no reason for an individual to accept the conclusion of that argument that they give. The terms have to be properly defined. The second aspect of every argument is the premises must be true. Now this is the one where it gets more, okay, now I actually have to do some thinking to figure this out. The first one and the last one, they're more like obvious things that you see that you can deal with and send them back to try again. Okay, but this second one, all premises must be true, we're going to see the importance of that later. Finally, the argument must be logically valid. In other words, the argument must be free of any formal fallacies. It must be structured the correct way. There also, by the way, and this goes more into number 2 and number 1, there can't be any material fallacies. In other words, the argument can't be an appeal to an illegitimate authority, argumentum advercundium. The argument cannot be a hasty generalization. All right, so there's some different fallacies that come into play here that we can look at to determine the validity of an argument. Asking the question, basically, do I have to accept this conclusion? Now, here's an important distinction. Just because an argument is invalid, just because one of the premises is false, just because a term is not properly defined, does not mean that the conclusion is not true. All this shows is you cannot use this specific argument to try to prove what you have set out to prove. Does that make sense? In other words, I can say this: the sky is blue, the grass is green, therefore all men will eventually die. Okay, the conclusion is true, all men will eventually die. We get that. But the major premise and the minor premise have absolutely nothing to do with the conclusion. All right? That is a exaggerated way of saying just because somebody stinks at making an argument doesn't mean that their conclusion is false. It just means they're not forming the argument correctly. So all we can really show when we're debating is the conclusion that you've set out does not necessarily follow from the argument that you presented. Now, the way that we prove that the conclusion is false is by bringing about our own version of the argument and showing that our conclusion does necessarily follow and that it is true. And so we'll talk more about that later. So if we want to disagree with the conclusion of somebody, we must do one of the following things. We have to show that the speaker used the term ambiguously. We have to show that a speaker has a false premise, that one of the lines in their syllogism simply is false. And then finally, we can also show that they committed a logical fallacy. Any one of these three things means you don't have to accept what someone said based upon their argument. Again, it doesn't mean their conclusion is necessarily false. There's extra steps you have to take to show that, but it does show that the way that they've reached their conclusion simply doesn't make any sense. So here's an example of a simple syllogism. And again, the reason why we're doing this is to familiarize ourselves with this language so that when we watch debates and we watch interactions between theologians, we know more what they're talking about. We can kind of understand them a little bit better. So here's an example of a simple syllogism. And the beauty of this is that, is that on their simplest level, syllogisms and arguments like this just make sense. It just makes common sense. So, all men are mortal. There's the major premise. We'll define this a little bit further. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Good morning, Joan. Good to see you this morning. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We're going to examine this and sort of talk about what is going on in this syllogism. So the first question we ask, are all the terms clear? How do we define the words that are used, the terms that are used within this proposition? And by the way, when I say term, I'm not referring to one particular word. A word is just part of the term. The term describes this idea or this this picture of something. Okay, so when we talk about terms, we're really talking about more than just a single word. We're talking about the major or the minor or the middle term, and I'm going to define what that is as we go on. So the terms used in this proposition are the terms men, mortal, and Socrates. Men simply means human beings. We understand that. Mortal means that which can die, and Socrates, of course, is an ancient Greek philosopher. So we have the terms properly defined. That means we cannot deny the conclusion of this based on an ambiguous term. So the second question we ask is the premise true? Are all men mortal? Yes. What we know leads to the conclusion that all men have the ability to die. All right. Is Socrates a man? Yes. The historical information we have regarding Socrates points to him being a human being. Is Socrates therefore mortal? Well, we don't know yet. Now we have to ask ourselves finally the question, is this argument, is this syllogism appropriately formed? We can't go right into saying, okay, yes, the conclusion is true, until we learn to recognize what constitutes a valid or an invalid argument. Here's something else I want you to pick up on. Terms within themselves, terms within and of themselves can never be true or false, and they can never be valid or invalid. Terms can only be clear or unclear. Okay? Premises, they can never be clear or unclear, and they can never be valid or invalid. When you talk about premises in a logical discussion, it must be true or false. And the same thing is true with arguments. Arguments can never be clear or unclear. Arguments can never be true or false. Arguments are either valid or invalid. Okay? That's some of the terminology that we need to learn to adopt when we're discussing this type of argumentation. So is the logic valid? Basically, we have two steps to determining whether or not the logic is valid in the syllogism. The first thing that we have to do is break it down. We got to figure out what part is what is the major premise, what is the minor premise. And by the way, the order that they appear on the screen isn't always the way that you determine if it's a major premise or a minor premise. We have to figure out what the major term is, what the middle term is, what the minor term is. And once we do that, and we're going to do that today, once we do that, then we use what's called Aristotle's 6 rules to determine the validity of the argument. So the major term, what's called the major term, is the predicate of the conclusion. In other words, therefore Socrates is mortal. The major term would be that which is mortal. Okay? The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. So you have the subject and then the predicate. So the subject of the conclusion in this case is Socrates. Socrates is mortal. He is the subject, and so he is called the minor term, whereas mortal, that which is mortal, is called the major term. And then you have this middle term. The middle term is what basically connects the whole thing together. All right, we're going to talk about the importance of that later. But the middle term is what connects the whole thing together. And in this case, the whole argument hinges upon whether or not Socrates is a man. Okay, so you have all these parts. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. The middle term is the remaining term. Now, the major premise is the premise that contains the major term. The minor premise is the premise that contains the minor term, and the conclusion is the one that contains both the major and minor terms. Think about it this way. If I were to tell you Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, does that make sense? Sure it does. The problem is it's not correctly ordered because it's the major premise comes from the major term. And so we can't just assume that the first premise that shows up is the major premise. We have to determine that based on the sentence structure of the conclusion. Okay? Now, not everybody, and I'm not saying that you have to, make arguments in this form. You don't have to be very formal. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. What you might say is, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. Because, and a lot of times, the minor premise is assumed. It's just simply known by everyone, okay? And that's sometimes what we do is we skip that minor premise. We'll skip some of this because we just inherently know it, so to speak, from our interactions with the world, all right? We may even say Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, and nobody would have any real problem with that. The purpose of syllogisms, then, is to get things in such a form on paper and in your mind so that you can deal with each part and you don't get caught up in all of the stuff that's just been sort of spewed out, all right? So, we have these 6 rules, and these 6 rules, which are called Aristotle's 6 rules. Again, this is taken from this book, Socratic Logic, by Peter Kreeft. So number 1, the first rule is this: a syllogism must have 3 and only 3 terms. This is because when you start dealing with the formal fallacies, the way that the argument flows, it doesn't work if you have 4 terms. It doesn't work if you have 4 things you're trying to deal with. You have to have these 3. Now, if you have 4, if you're trying to come up with this syllogism and these 4 terms keep popping up and you're like, I don't really know what to do with this, it seems like there's 4 terms here. Usually what that means is you have to break their argument down into a series of syllogisms where the conclusion of one ends up being one of the premises of one of the following. And again, I'll show you an example of that as we progress through the lesson. A syllogism must also have 3 and only 3 propositions. Now, if you again trying to deal with an argument and it seems like there's a 4th you need to put in there, then usually what that means is you have a presupposition that both you and the person you're talking with have, and you can put that presupposition out in the form of a syllogism, in a second syllogism. Okay, the middle term must be distributed at least once. I want to talk about this for just a moment. Listen to the syllogism, and it's going to sound wrong to you because it is wrong. All dogs are animals. All cats are animals. Therefore, all dogs are cats. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that we have an undistributed middle term. The middle term, animals, is not used universally in any way. And so we can't prove that all dogs are cats from this argument. So we have to make sure that the middle term is distributed. It's used conclusively. Okay, so for example, this is an argument that's used in Peter Kreeft's book. All saints, let's see. No babies are sages. All saints are sages. Therefore, no babies are saints. This is the argument that he uses, of course, coming from a Catholic background. He is. I sounded like Yoda. The point being is that there we have something that is fully exhausts the term sage. Okay, no babies are sages, which basically, if you draw this out in a circle, what this does is it completely excludes the term baby from the term sage. All right. Now, when you look at the syllogism that we have here, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. This is live, Philip. This is live. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Notice that all men are mortal. That doesn't leave any room for wiggling there in the syllogism. Okay, so this is what we mean when we say the middle term must be distributed at least once. Number 4, the 4th rule is no term that is undistributed in the premise may be distributed in the conclusion. Let me read to you the example here from the book that Peter Kreeft has on the subject. Okay, compassion is a virtue. Justice is not compassion. Therefore, justice is not a virtue. Do you see the issue with that? It's not using one of these terms universally, and so there's no way that the conclusion can follow. It doesn't make logical sense. Hey, what's up? Philip Jones from Wellington, New South Wales, Australia. Wow, great free to be here. Really do appreciate you. And Blue Star Static. Sup homie to you, too. Okay. So the fifth rule of Aristotle's 6 rules of syllogisms, we have no syllogism can have 2 negative premises. So I cannot say something like this. Dogs are not humans. Okay. Cats are not humans. And therefore, dogs are not cats. That doesn't make any sense at all. We have to have some sort of positive and then a negative declaration. Or you can have or you can have 2 positives, all right? But you can't have 2 negative premises. That does not fit. Is my name causing you consternation? No. So if one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. If the conclusion is negative, then one premise must be positive. And again, we're going to go into some examples of this later on. So do these 6 rules apply to the syllogism that we've presented? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Are there 3 and only 3 terms? Check. Do they have 3 propositions? Check. Is the middle term distributed? Well, look, all men are mortal. Now, Socrates is a man, that's not distributed. But all men are mortal, that is a proper distribution of the middle term. Okay, do we have, do we have what's called an illicit minor or major? No, we don't. If you go back to Rule 4, just to further define that for you, no term that is undistributed in the premise may be distributed in the conclusion. And so we are saying all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, all of Socrates is mortal. So this checks out. Rule number 5, are there more than 1 negative premises? No, there's not. Rule number 6, 1 negative premise equals 1 negative conclusion and vice versa. That rule checks out too. So this rule, this argument that we presented, all the terms were clear. The premises were both true. The logic was valid. Therefore, Socrates was mortal. Here's the important part. Logic trumps emotions. No matter how badly you may wish for Socrates to still be alive, it will not change the facts that he was mortal, and so he died. Debates, therefore, must be about truth and not simply emotion. If we have something that we learn simply doesn't follow, we have to re-examine it. We can't accept a conclusion based off of ambiguous terms, faulty premises, and invalid logic. The conclusion may be true, but we must only accept it when we show that it's true and prove that it's true through these ways that we discussed. You also have, in the world of syllogisms, what's called a hypothetical syllogism. And the reason why I included this one is because this is going to sound more like Don Preston to you than the first one is. Because generally what Don will say, if it is the case that the death that Adam died is spiritually, then it must be the case that Jesus, came to deal with spiritual death. Therefore, whatever. Jesus came to deal with spiritual death. And so this sounds more, you've probably heard Don say on more than one occasion, if it is the case that such and such and such. And so this is the one that you'd be more familiar with, so let's deal with it. This type of syllogism is actually way easier to see if it's valid than a simple syllogism. So here's the argument we're going to be looking at now. If I have a test, I will need a pencil. Today I have a test, therefore today I will need a pencil. And we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. At least it's fun to me. Okay, so let's identify the parts of this syllogism. The antecedent, what we call the antecedent, what we label as P, is I have a test. This is our antecedent. The consequent, which we label as Q, is I will need a pencil. If I have a test, I will need a pencil. There's our antecedent followed by our consequent. Now, the antecedent and the consequent can either be denied or affirmed. In other words, I can say, I do not have a test today. Or I can say, I do not need a pencil. I could also say, I have a test today, or I need to have a pencil. Now, depending upon which one is affirmed and which one is denied, determines the validity of a hypothetical syllogism. So, a lot of stuff on the screen. Don't worry, we're going to work through it. This is valid. If P implies Q, in other words, if the consequent implies Q, if I have a test, I will need a pencil. That's what we're doing. And P is true. Let's see. If P is true, then Q is true. This is called affirming the antecedent. So you can use this type of argument, but if you say today I have a test, then Q must be true as well. We're going to talk about that in a second. That's valid. You can affirm. You can say, yes, I have a test today. That makes sense. We're going to talk about why in a second. If P implies Q and Q is not true, then P is not true. So if you say this, if I have a test, I will need a pencil. Today I do not need a pencil. Therefore, today I do not have a test. That works. That makes sense. That's logically valid. But let's look at the last two cases. The last two cases show invalid forms of using a hypothetical syllogism. So I'm going to say it like this. If I have a test, I will need a pencil. I do not have a test, therefore today I do not need a pencil. Now, that doesn't necessarily follow, and here's why. It may be that I have to write a paper today. It might be that I have to take notes in class today. So just because I do not have a test doesn't mean that I don't have to have a pencil. It just simply, this hypothetical syllogism simply just shows that if you do have a test, then you definitely will need a pencil. The absence of a test does not necessarily mean that you don't have to have a pencil. All right? And that's called affirming the consequent. You can't do that. Here's the other idea. If P implies Q, oops, I got it backwards. I did the second one first. If P implies Q and Q is true, then P is true. Sorry, I got that mixed up. The first one we did was denying the antecedent. I was working backwards here. The first one that we did was denying the antecedent. This is called affirming the consequent. If P implies Q and Q is true, then P is true. So you can't do this. If I have a test, I will need a pencil. Today I have a pencil, therefore today I have a test. So this does not make sense either. All right? Just because you have a pencil, again, doesn't mean that you have a test. You might have a quiz, you might have to take notes, whatever. And so whenever someone sets up a hypothetical syllogism, they have to follow these rules. There's only 4. They're easy to remember, and they just make sense. But it's important for us to familiarize ourselves with syllogisms so that, 1, when we're watching people debate, we know what's going on, but 2, whenever we're debating ourselves, we'll also know how to form arguments, what works, what doesn't, what's logically valid, what is logically invalid. And so what we're going to do is take a look at some of this today, specifically dealing with death. Here is the basic argument that most people give in regards to the resurrection. What's going on, Chad Keno? Here's their basic argument. If the resurrection is past, then death has already been defeated. People still die today, so the resurrection must be future. Now, what you do is you take this basic argument that people give, this usual argument that people present as, as proof that preterism or whatever you're dealing with is false. And you take that and you turn it into a syllogism. And then you can deal with it properly and exhaustively. So here's how this argument above would look in a syllogistic form. If death is defeated, then people live forever. People do not live forever, therefore death is not defeated. That's the general argument stated in a syllogistic pattern. Whoa. Okay. Let's take a look at this then from a perspective. How do you deal with this argument? Well, one way you deal with it is by showing that the major premise has 2 terms that are used ambiguously. The terms death and live forever need to be properly defined. The assumption may be that both of these terms refer to physical life and death, or may refer to spiritual life and death. What we have to do is deal with each of these definitions and see which one is meant by the speaker and which one is meant by us. And so, let's see. And so the proper way to form this then would be to say, if physical death is defeated, then people live forever. People do live forever physically. People do not live forever physically. Therefore, physical death is not defeated. Now, this argument, again, is using is more clearly defined, and this is the type of thing that we need to say. But whenever someone further defines it as physical death and physical living forever, now we can deal with it appropriately. See, the problem with this, hey Ashley, how you doing this morning? The problem with this is that people use terms as they define them to deal with arguments that we may give in terms as we define them. And so we need to come together and explain what we're talking about, and properly define what we're talking about, so we can deal with these arguments correctly. So the following syllogisms that I'm going to give deal with this assumed definition of physical death versus physical life and spiritual death versus spiritual life. So here it is. This is the one that I made. The death that Jesus would defeat is the death that all die in Adam. Another good thing to do with syllogisms is form it in such a way that people can agree with most of it, and that way you only really have to work on dealing with one or two of the premises, or hopefully just one. The death that Jesus would defeat is the death that all die in Adam. This makes sense. This is shown in Scripture. In Adam all die, in Christ all should be made alive. So this is our major premise. This, if you can see that, yeah. The death that Jesus would defeat, this is the major term, is the death that all die in Adam. This is the minor term. The death that all die in Adam is the death that Adam died in the day that he ate the fruit. Again, this is a premise that everyone should agree with. All right? Everyone should agree with the fact that the death that Adam died and the day that he ate the fruit is the death that all die in Adam. This is the death that he introduced into the world. Okay, so this is our major premise. This is our minor premise. This is our conclusion. Therefore, the death that Jesus would defeat is the death that Adam died in the day that he ate the fruit. See, nobody should disagree with this, because this is what is clearly taught in Scripture. And we put the verses out here just to sort of explain that and show that and prove it. Excuse me. So let's take a look at this now. Here's another syllogism that I put forth. Physically alive beings are not physically dead. Obvious, right? Adam, after he ate the fruit, was a physically alive being. Now, is that true or not true? Obviously it is. He lived 930 years, right? Therefore, Adam, after he ate the fruit, was not physically dead. Now, we can examine all these syllogisms to determine whether or not they're true, whether or not they follow, whether or not the premises are true, whether or not the syllogism logically follows, and whether or not the terms are used clearly. So let's follow up with the syllogism here. Physical death is not the death that Adam died in the day that he ate the fruit. Jesus would defeat the death that Adam died in the day that he ate the fruit. Therefore, Jesus would not defeat physical death. Now, do you get the force of this argument? In Prestonese, you would say, do you catch the power of this? Let's walk through it again. The original argument is, well, if the resurrection is past, then death has already been defeated. People still die today, so the resurrection must be future. This is generally how people combat preterism, specifically the idea that the resurrection is past already. And so what you have is you take that, you put it into this way. That way you can deal with it point by point and step by step, as we talked about in the introduction to this video. I want to show you one more of these from a different perspective. Let's see. I know I had one that was a more of a complicated idea. See, me rewording all these really messed me up too. Okay, I don't know where it went. Let's look at the late date argument. Okay, so here's another basic argument, and once we do this, we're going to be probably done. This wasn't meant to be a long video. Okay, here's the basic argument that people give. Revelation was written in the late 90s during the reign of Domitian. Since Revelation is prophecy, it could not have all been fulfilled by AD 70. So here's this argument formed in a basic syllogism. Prophecies written in AD 96 cannot be fulfilled in AD 70. Now, I agree with that, right? Revelation contains prophecies written in AD 96, therefore Revelation cannot be fulfilled in AD 70. This is their basic argument, put in a simple way, in a simple syllogistic way, so that we can deal with it. Nobody talks like this, all right? But we think like this, and that's why we use syllogisms. Now, if you check this out, you'll see that there are no logical fallacies. There's no ambiguous terms in the syllogism. So really all we have to go on now is, are the major and minor premises, are they both true? If they're both true, we're in trouble. But in this case, the minor premise, that is, Revelation contains prophecies written in AD 96, is not true. There are three arguments generally used to support the late date of Revelation. They are church tradition, Domitian persecution, and the correlation to the book of Daniel concerning the fall of Rome. And for some reason, I've got two charts here that are the same. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. You can deal with things in different ways, and here's the way I deal with the late date. So the first argument is argumentum ad verecundium. This is a material fallacy. We're going to check out a chart to deal with that here in a second. Appealing to church tradition does not prove anything, because appealing to church tradition is appealing to an illegitimate authority. All right? Now, appealing to an authority is not wrong within and of itself, because appealing to authority is sometimes very valid, and I could give you some examples of that, but I'll just refer you to good old Peter Kreeft and Socratic logic. The second idea of a Domitian persecution, there's no evidence of a Domitian persecution. There only may have been one. And so this is not, you cannot use a maybe idea to prove a universal. And this is what people are doing when they appeal to a Domitian persecution. All right, the third argument that they use, that is correlation to the book of Daniel, this is what we call a non sequitur. Now, Revelation could be about the fall of Rome and still be written prior to AD 70. Now, the book of Daniel certainly was written prior to AD 70, and if they want to say it's about the fall of Rome, then there's no reason to push Revelation to the late 90s because of this either. So notice how we dealt with this argument. We did not deal with this argument by showing that terms were used ambiguously. We did not deal with this argument by showing that the logic was invalid. We simply dealt with it by showing that their minor premise was false, or at least could be false. In other words, they didn't give enough evidence to prove what they set out to show. They basically made an assertion. So what this means is, now we wait for them. Now they come back and they say, oh, see here, and here is why Revelation was written in AD 96 based upon this information. Now once they do that, now you can deal with it. But you don't have to chase rabbits. You do not have to deal with an argument that someone does not properly make. You show them their problem and make them bring you something that you can hold on to. Accepting their argument is not the way to go. You need to make them and force them into making a correct, logically valid argument with clearly defined terms where the premises have been shown to be true. Let's take a look at this Church Fathers Dill now, because this is fun. Okay, here's the basic argument again. And this comes from, by the way, the reason why we're going here is because some people appeal to church tradition to support a late date of Revelation. So let's take a look. Here's the basic argument. None of the church fathers understood preterism. It did not gain popularity until J. Stuart Russell / Max King / Don Preston / whoever you want to put there. And generally, whoever you want to put there depends on an individual's understanding of history. So there you go. Could Christians have gotten it wrong for 2,000 years? So we have a lot of issues with this statement. We have basically an appeal to the masses. Could Christians have gotten it wrong for 2,000 years? Because the answer is, well, since Christians are fallible, then yes. Okay? We cannot appeal to the masses for proof of whatever it is that we're doing. We also cannot appeal to the emotions by saying, are you telling me that my grandpappy was wrong when he talked about the coming of the Lord? Okay, that doesn't work. Just because your grandpappy thought that the coming of the Lord was in his future doesn't make it so. Again, emotional arguments are not proof of anything. Can they be very useful in some places? Yes, but they're not actual proof of anything when you're trying to determine whether or not something is true or something is false. So basically, here is what someone is saying when they make an argument from the church fathers. They're saying, one, all truth must be found in the church fathers. Whenever they say it's not found in the church fathers, they're really saying that all truth must be found there. Okay? The other thing the next thing they say is preterism is not found in the church fathers, therefore preterism is not true. We got a whole lot going on in this argument, but here's some basic things. Number one, this major premise contains the material fallacy argumentum advocandum. It's an appeal to an illegitimate authority. Our final authority is always, has always been, and will always be the Bible. What does the Bible say? What does it teach? What can we draw from it? All right? The minor premise is an argument from silence, which is also a material fallacy. Just because it is asserted that there is no preterism found in the church fathers does not mean that early Christians did not hold to a preterist position. Now, there is evidence that an early fulfillment of the apocalypse, Revelation, is found in the church fathers. But that's not the point right now. You cannot assert something based on silence. That's not good either. That is a fallacious way to deal with things. So it assumes again that no Christians held a preterist view from the late 1st century forward. Thus, again, the conclusion does not necessarily follow. All right, here's what we've done today. We have defined what a syllogism is. We've shown what it looks like. We've shown what's necessary whenever we're trying to argue and deal with different things. We have shown hypothetical syllogisms and what's necessary and what's necessary components of them. We've shown examples of all of these things and even had a little fun dealing with syllogisms, showing the issues with them, and offering alternative solutions. So hope this has been beneficial to you. Hope that now you can come back to this video, maybe think about it a little bit more, study it a little bit, and so the next time you watch a debate, you're not so lost in terms of what people are talking about when they're talking about major premise and major terms and minor terms and middle terms, and you can follow it a little bit better. This is what I had to do. Had to read this book in order to get a better grasp on these things, and I would encourage you to do the same. Let's see. All right, I think that's about it. Thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate all your comments. I saw y'all were going back and forth there for a while. I didn't have really time to follow all of that, but I'm sure you'll solve all the problems in the world if you work together. So y'all have a great day. I will see you later, and God bless.